Hey, it's 3.2 step 3, and this video is about structure, the fragmented and non-chronological structure, to be precise, of the things they carried. So let's take some notes. First of all, what is it? Well, we're talking about the narrative structure, how the story is organized. And what's most interesting about the narrative structure in this book is the fragmentation. And what that means is that the stories are broken up. Okay, they're fragmented. They're like little shards of glass. If you took a mirror and smashed it, the stories are kind of like picking up various little shards of that mirror and then describing them. And so that's why I've got my little fragmented kitty here. Things aren't told all together. All of the details in a story are not told from beginning to end altogether. They're just broken up a lot. They're also not necessarily in time order. So the chapters themselves don't follow, they're non-chronological. They don't follow time order from beginning to end. And then sometimes within the chapters, there are also things that are a bit out of order. So what you're watching for as you're reading is how are the chapters broken up. You can look for the actual spacing that shows a break from one section to the next. You can also look at how they are organized, what you hear about when and where in each chapter. Also look for how the chapters are interrelated, how the different chapters connect to each other. And then something else that's interesting is some chapters seem to be isolated. They're just sort of on their own and they don't connect to other chapters. And sometimes they're not fragmented very much either. And so you can watch for that as well. So let's talk about examples in the first reading, pages 1 to 58. First of all, the very first chapter, called The Things They Carried, we have a story about these GIs in the war. And we know when it is. We know it is in April of 1968. And the main event in that chapter is Ted Lavender's death. We hear specific details about how he dies right away on page 2. Ted Lavender was shot in the head outside the village of Tonke in mid-April. So those are some really specific details that we get right away. However, we don't come back to like any more of that story for 4 more pages. And we hear the listing of the different things that the GIs are carrying, and we get inside of the head of Lieutenant Jimmy Cross and hear about his thoughts about Martha, but we don't hear more information on how this death took place until page 6. And then what's interesting there is that on page 6 we hear about how he was killed, the description of the moment of his death. Just the fact that he went down under an exceptional burden and he falls, flat dead without any of the sort of Hollywood theatrics. So it's sort of the description of him physically dying. And then it isn't for another 3 pages that we hear the story of how he died, where he was, where the other GIs were, and all of those things that you would consider kind of crucial to telling a story. So this is a very fragmented story, right? We hear sort of the climax in a sense, right? That he is shot in the head right away on page 2. Then we hear the description of how he looked when he died. And then the story starts on page 9 with the beginning of this mission, the fact that they are going to, I'm not sure why my face disappeared. Sorry, guys. Why they are going to do what they're doing. They're being tasked with this mission of searching out and destroying the elaborate tunnel complexes. And then on page 11, we hear that Ted Lavender popped a tranquilizer and went off to pee. So we hear how he is related in this situation of searching the tunnels. And then on page 12, that's when we see him actually shot, right? Lee Strunk made a funny ghost sound. Right then, Ted Lavender was shot in the head on his way back from peeing. And so even though his is the death, he's sort of in the margin of this story. The main focus isn't on Ted Lavender. And it's really just in these little fragmented bits we hear about his death. So it's a very interesting way to structure that story in that chapter. If we go then to the next chapter, Love, we can see that this is many years after the war. And so as far as chronology goes, as soon as we see the next chapter, the Spin, which is also kind of remembering the war, but then getting back into it, we see some of the non-chronological ordering, right? Because we're many years after the war, but then we're also back in the war, having some descriptions. And this is a great quote if you're going to write about the fragmentation of these chapters, from page 34, because O'Brien, the narrator, says, "What sticks to memory often are those odd little fragments that have no beginning and no end." And so he uses this word fragment, which is such an important way to describe the structure of the book, and connects it to memory and how, sometimes that's how we remember things. We don't remember it in a perfect story structure. We just have this little fragment, this little shard of memory. On the Rainy River is the next chapter after Spin. And in this chapter, we go all the way back to before the war, the summer of 1968, when Tim O'Brien, the character, gets his draft notice. And so this is another really good example of the non-chronological structure. It's kind of interesting that that chapter is not fragmented. It's really told in kind of a typical fashion, the structure of beginning the story at the beginning and then moving to the middle and then getting to the end, as we follow him on that 6-day trek up at Tip Top Lodge, is followed pretty, smoothly. All right, effects of this literary aspect. Well, the fragmented and out of order nature of some stories parallel memories, and how fragments stick to memory and come back out of order. And so when we are reading it, we sort of feel like we are being given these fragments of memory, almost like we readers are experiencing the memories just as the character narrator is. And it probably also makes us feel the chaos and disorder of the war and the memories of it, because it was so traumatic and chaotic. The memories follow that sort of format as well. It also creates the feeling that some memories are buried or placed at a distance from consciousness for a reason. We don't have that focus on Ted Lavender in that first chapter. He's sort of in the margins of the story, even though he is the one who is perhaps, the biggest or worst victim, in that he's the one who loses his life. The non-chronological sequencing of chapters makes the reader question what organizes the narrative. So what is it that is carrying this thread of a story from one paragraph to the next? And in that first chapter, I think it is, what the GIs are carrying, both physically and emotionally. Part of that being the guilt of Ted Lavender's death, which is maybe why, Ted Lavender is not focused on quite as much. All right, so the themes, the power of voice to create truths is our first one. Describing the most traumatic events in a fragmented way where the events don't seem to be central to the narrator's main line of thought seemingly lessens its emphasis and importance. Think about why one might do that. The burden of war stories, the impact of war on the psyche, memory, and beliefs of the soldiers in Vietnam parallels the disjunction and random seeming ordering. So in the same way that the reader can't make sense of these events, the GIs can't make sense of these events. Innocence, guilt, and redemption, burying the most traumatic events in the shards of the fragmented narrative, sometimes works to distance the narrator from the things he feels guilty about. Story and imagination as creative forces. Retelling the stories allows the narrator to organize his thoughts and how his experiences in Vietnam connect to the rest of his life. So this is done in sort of a retrospective way, right? 20 years after the events, the narrator is trying to sort of make sense of them. And you can determine by the end of the book if he's able to do that, if he's able to make some sense out of the senselessness. All right, thanks for taking notes.